get set up with the mics.
Well, hello.
Levels right now. So, Tobin, you got a story?
Yeah, so my 3-year-old the other day was telling me a fairy tale of her own design. And it just said, this is a story about a princess with red hair who is not Ariel. And she had a wicked mother and then a good mother, not like Snow White. And I said, really, how did that happen? She said, the wicked mother died.
Whoa.
Oh.
She's making this up, the whole thing.
Yeah, it's good to acknowledge your influences and then how you're going to differentiate yourself from that which has come before. I thought she really had a good handle on that. She said, this is not like Snow White. I said, well, how did her wicked mother die? Well, she was sewing by a window like Snow White's good mother. And then she made a mistake and she sewed up instead of down.
Whoa.
And she poked her finger and she died. I said, really? She said, yeah. And she was using the wrong kind of needle. She used the dye needle.
Instead of the sew needle.
Mm-hmm. And then the princess got a good mother.
How old is Rose?
She was 3. She was 4 now. She was 3 when she was just telling this story. I was impressed because it was sort of a synthesis of familiar elements, but put her own spin on it. And she was very aware of that, exactly what the new spin was.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So she obviously has a good knowledge of fairy tales. And how did your wife feel about this? Did she ask, like, which mother am I?
The good mother.
Like, because let me psychoanalyze your story on that one. Am I the one who died? Did I freak myself, or am I the good one who comes in?
All right, guys. So it's on books today, and I'm here with Christopher Blackburn, Jeremiah Owens, storyteller Tobin Doobie, and I'm Leigh Bortins with Classical Conversations. Thanks for that story. And Rose is exceptional. You know, it's interesting. You have another one.
Yes.
I can't remember. Claire. Is she speaking that well yet? Can she even tell stories?
She's about 19 months old.
So
she doesn't do stories, but she has engaged in literary criticism.
I believe it.
When we're reading her a book and it has a dog on the page, and she says, "Dog, that book."
There we go.
Throw in that last word there. Well, she threw in that last word there, so we know she doesn't think it's a real dog. It's a picture of a dog in a book, and that's an important. That's something artists have been wrestling with for centuries.
That's a good distinction.
That's what I interpreted in her sentence there, and I was proud of her.
When you said literary criticism with an 18-month-old, I was thinking she just knocked it out of your hand.
Oh,
bad book.
Your kids are so limited. They criticize. My kids criticize everything. We're further advanced.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, we're very critical in our house.
How old are they, and how are they critical?
Oh, my oldest is 12, and then 10, and then 7, and then 3. And it's just the typical, let me examine that and see if it meets my needs and my tastes, and then criticize if it doesn't. Human nature, that's all it is. It's just sin.
So we know a good story from pretty early on.
I think so.
And okay, why?
Because it matches the rhythm of human thought.
Expound, sir.
Well, I've been reading Hero of a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, and he was an anthropologist who went around the world systematizing, or not, he didn't set out to systematize, he just set out to study folklore and mythology from all cultures, but he discovered that they follow the similar pattern, and he boiled that pattern down in his book to the basic pattern of all fairy tales. And you'll find that all successful stories follow the hero's journey, which is this pattern he laid out. The departure from home, the threshold into the unknown, the lowest point, the transformation, and the return. And I think that he thinks, and this resonates with me too, that it is a psychological reality too, that this is actually the rhythm of our grappling with a new problem. And that's why we write our stories in that rhythm, not always consciously, but that's why stories resonate with us.
What about being part of the Word made flesh and His creation? I mean, words and stories.
I think it ties in. I think it ties into that. I'm not sure. I don't think I can offer opinion yet on what that connection is. other than this is the way we are made to function. But I've been that's something I'm continuing to think about. Yeah.
Well, if we're wired to know him and to make him known, and we do that primarily through his word, his world, our conscience, the church. I mean, there's limited ways that are very specific that we do that through. You would think we'd be wired to understand the stories that they tell and the things that they symbolize and represent. The family, that'd be another one. I mean, there's some things that just automatically symbolize the stories he's trying to tell us, and that's where we live.
Yep.
Okay, so we like stories. All right, so I have some questions for you guys, and then we're going to talk about some more of our own personal stories afterwards. How do you think books build or reduce memoria? Let me ask that a different way. Before we started before we were on the air, Jeremiah was talking about just discussing, should we read books? Do people need books? Christopher said we have so many other media to get our stories from. What is it that's great about books and building our memoria? And what is it or do books reduce our memoria, as people at the time of the printing press would have argued, and maybe me too at this point?
Well, before that even, there's been a debate that's going on since Socrates. He felt that we should not write things down and learn from texts, but should learn directly from the great minds.
So,
well, okay, so let's talk about that. So Socrates was saying that because he said that when an art form is put on a piece of paper, like writing, the pitch was that it extends your memory, because then you can go back and recall it at any point.
That was when they pitched it to the human race.
No, like
That
Socrates is telling the story, right, of Thomas and the deity, and the deity is going and explaining to Thomas all these different art forms, right? And writing was one of them. Painting was another one, and he's showing these writing, and he said, "Look, I've come up with this great way to extend the recall of humanity by being able to write these things down." Yeah. And then the rebuttal is, of course, no, that you're not doing that. What you're doing, because there's no interaction, was the fault. And Socrates was saying that, because Socrates never wrote anything down. People recorded things that he said, but he himself never wrote anything down. So Socrates' argument was that writing is bad because there's no give and take. Wasn't that it?
I think that was as I understand, that was his objection to it, is that the author of a text can't be interrogated, can't be asked a question.
So if you're reading it and you say, wait a minute, I disagree with this, or I'd like to ask a question or explore more, the book's not going to tell you anything more than it's already told you. Yeah.
So I would say one of the ways you overcome that is by being a prolific writer. And so I've never had a conversation with, say, C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or even St. Paul or Peter. And yet, by reading them more and more and more, and especially if they have a lot of different writings, you start to find answers to your questions that they wrote down.
Well, isn't that an argument against books in a way? Like, now that we have all of this technology, today, you have things that are much more instant. Like, you still have the written word, of course, in blogs and in these different articles that you can write online, and you can engage with your reader in a way that you couldn't back, when you were writing on, 1,000 years ago. So, but now,
through the comment section on the blog page.
Yeah, like through the comment section, or you can send them an email or tweet them, or whatever it would be. But you can access and you can engage in that discussion, which removes that argument of Socrates, right? Because you do have that engagement now.
Well, you almost have the engagement. Well, I don't know if you had the same engagement with the author, but one thing Socrates may not have anticipated was for many thousands of people to have had access to the same book and being able to travel anywhere and converse with people who've read this book. That's a different experience than before there was writing. And I don't know if it replaces talking to the author, but it is an additional phenomenon.
As I say, for example, the Aeneid is the most translated next to the Bible. Now you can go pretty much anywhere in the world, and there's copies of the Aeneid in that language that people have probably studied through and read that you can find and have conversations about the same stories. And that's what we're getting at with stories, that it reveals a truth about us, that stories exist to talk and speak to us. That's something I struggle with, is actually getting into fiction, because I know it's better for me than just reading nonfiction, because there's something to be said about having to interpret something because you're actually seeking that information as opposed to just having the information given and presented to you. You value it differently when you actually have to mine it out yourself. And so stories serve as a sort of benchmark we can all reference and look to inquire about the nature of ourselves.
The other thing is, it's not always bad to have a one-sided conversation. In other words, you listen to what the person said and you read it and you listen many, many, many times. And then you stop reading and you go dwell on it and think your own thoughts in relationship to it. So you're not trying to argue as much as try to understand another person really well because they can't argue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because Socrates was saying it's like a painting. He's saying, when a book and a painting, they just sit there and they say what they're going to say. And then if you have a question for it, you ask it and it would just repeat itself all over again for you. And you're saying that's good because then you're forced to just kind of let it ruminate for a while?
In a sense, yes. And actually, I would go deeper to say that it's a painting as compared to a photograph. In the case that with a book, you're taking an information that's been painted over in many, many layers. So you're looking at this portrait and seeing all the depth and time and energy that went into crafting its narrative, as opposed to a conversation where someone's giving you a one pass and then you have to just remember and hope that you got and understood what they said.
So if you're saying that the author then would have exhaustively researched everything to the point where he has no more answers, nothing else to say, and he's the empirical authority on that subject, and so he says it, and so there's no need for a discourse.
No, I think you're seeing better into their mind because they've communicated well and effectively what they intended to say. Hopefully, if they've actually spent their time and actually spent time working on their book like they ought to have before they published it, then you're actually seeing into their mind in a way that you probably wouldn't if you just sat and had a conversation with them.
Okay, so what about this? Here's where I'm saying. I'm thinking that perhaps we're maybe in a post-book society, and that may not be a bad thing. Because like if you have no author is going to exhaustively know everything about the subject. Once they write the book, then someone's going to say, "Oh, I have a question about this," or "I think I disagree with you on this part." Okay, so then at that point, the book is no longer relevant because then you're engaged in the discussion. So just get rid of the book to begin with, and put out stuff that's make it digital, because then people can interact with you and you can answer back and forth, and then you can actually have that conversation which you and Socrates say is so important.
Like put it out digitally, how? Like in emails and letters or in blog posts?
Well, blog posts, I mean, here, this is 2019, we have the internet. So however that form that, is, I mean, whether it's small snippets like Instagram, of course, it's very difficult to, develop, arguments through, 140 characters on Twitter. But at the same time, you can post it online, go back and have a comment section back and forth where you do engage your audience in discussions.
But aren't those things all small books?
They are small books, but what I'm saying is the written, like holding paper in your hand. Aren't we past that as a society now?
Well, I don't think that a book is essentially the paper, because before paper they had books.
So
on animal skin. It's the medium
so with
changes.
You, the idea is important, and I agree with you. Yeah. I think we should have well-researched discussions about topics. I agree with you. I'm just saying this whole thing, holding a book in your hand like a paper brick, we don't necessarily need that anymore, do we? Aren't we kind of a post-book society because we can get the benefits of a book plus the discussion?
I'm not disagreeing. I'm not sure that it's important to even say that we're a post-book society, because before the printing press, there were very few copies of books, and people's experience, and very few people could read. So the common man's experience of a book would be to meet with somebody who could read it to him. So it wasn't even at that point holding a book in your hand.
Yeah,
we
for a while.
Stats there before that, because that's a presupposition. I don't know that it's true. Is they think that pre-printing press, there'd been over 20 million books printed, and 30% of the population read regularly. Now the other 70% didn't read at all, but the 30% who read fairly often.
But they read academically. They weren't necessarily pleasure reading like people do today. When people say, "Oh, you should read," they mean, "Oh, you should go and read the latest, young adult fiction novel." That's what I think I hear people saying. Or, "Oh, you need to read the self-help book on essentialism or something."
Yeah.
And so that's when I hear when I talk to people about like, "Oh, you need to be reading more." They're promoting this kind of self-indulgent reading rather than a storied or a textured reading like you're referring to, where the things that were actually written were of more value.
There was also a lot of reading due to commerce, just plain old trade skills and trade information. And then, of course, you had your scriptures and whatever was written down from histories. So you didn't write. You're totally right. There was no nonfiction going around. It wasn't until really the era of the Austins, 1800s, that fiction got to be so popular. So it was factual information.
It was around the time that they began printing the paperback books is when I think it really started to take off because it became cheaper and more accessible and also cheaper for authors to produce books. So they got into the hands of everyone as opposed to being this harder process to actually get your things bound into libraries.
So the process of reading has changed completely. Like you mentioned passive, was it passive reading or how indulgent reading, how you just do it for yourself? That wasn't always the case, was it? Because it wasn't for hundreds of years, up until probably maybe the Age of Enlightenment, that when people read, they read out loud to the people around them. And it was a community. It was a very communal thing. The purpose of reading the book was not so much for you to gain information, but to promote discourse and discussion between you and the people around you. Like I know Augustine back in the 400s wrote about how he was visiting the Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, and he talked about how Ambrose would actually sit and read silently. And Augustine in Confessions talks about how that actually offended him a little bit because it was so different. He says, look, when you read, you're supposed to read out loud. Like the equivalent today would be, like you're talking to someone and they're texting on their phone. Right there in the room with you, but they're engaging in something that doesn't include you. Because reading back then was supposed to be inclusive of all the people around you. And so Augustine says, no. Ambrose is doing it all wrong by reading to himself.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did not know that.
So I thought, but you mentioned the how the printing press and how the 1800s and paperback and the developments there. I read that during the Age of Enlightenment, people who just read were considered passive members of society, consumers, and less members of society than people who actually wrote.
To add on to that, there is more to be said about having the conversations, to be speaking with people in community. For instance, you can read to yourself to learn things and to seek out information by looking to a book and reading it for your answer. But I know that when I'm looking for an answer and I start reading something looking for that answer, I'm probably going to find the answer I set out to find, no matter what the text actually says. I'm reflexively pushing in one direction, as opposed to when you actually have to go have a conversation with somebody, and then you're getting a perspective beyond your own and outside yourself. When you're seeking and inquiring, and they're actually correctively telling you something, correctively understanding your point, and then directing yours. And so I think you're a more rounded, more full person when you see reading as a contribution to the greater conversation you have with others, as opposed to the end means to take in the material, the answers that you want.
Yeah, you feel part of more. All the reading that I've done, so I travel all around the world, and I can't go anywhere where I don't know something more about where I'm at because I've read about it, and that's stayed with me. I want to push back on you. Keep that thought. I see you have a thought, but I'm supposed to be the keeper of the book, and you were saying, okay, we passed that time, and I was trying to think. I think I have a different response than I might have even 4 years ago, because I'm losing my sight, and so I can't read books like I used to, and I can tell you it's a loss. And so it makes me feel really sad for people who've never read books voraciously. I don't know that I've been doing this long enough that I can really express what the loss is yet. I just know I'm really disappointed at the end of each day because I've not engaged in as many thoughts as I have with other people. Now, you could say, but you could do that all day long with internet information. Well, internet information tends to be in little bites, not big dissertations and whole chapters and 700 pages. And so one of the things I can tell you I've noticed is that with my lack of reading, 400 or 500 pages a day, that's what I used to do. Now I'm lucky if I get 50 in. I can't hold ideas and wait to come to conclusions and synthesize information as easily as I used to when I read all the time. There was something about that. So maybe it was just because my arms were hurting holding that big, heavy tome and maybe pay more attention, or I'm not good at internet reading. Maybe that's a problem. Maybe I'm too old and I don't know how to do it right. But I do know there's a loss. and I may not be able to describe it for a while because I'm just experiencing it now.
So let me ask you about that. So when you read now, do you still read paper books, or do you read like on a Kindle or a Nook or an e-reader or something like that?
I almost have to read on something that I can expand the letters to big. I could go get probably, the large print books. I'd probably be fine with that. But that's one advantage to a tablet, is you can make the letters pretty big.
Yeah.
The thing is, how you flick your finger? I'm flicking my finger every second.
Yeah.
Read, because there's not many words on the page for me to read it.
Okay, so here's a question, because obviously, there are a lot of benefits to an e-reader. It's backlit. You can store a ton of books on there.
Can read at night.
You can highlight. You can make notes. Go back and search. You can Control F. You can find notes, things like that. Do you take advantage of those? Do you think maybe that's a step up on the paper book?
To me, that's a loss, because on the paper books, I didn't need to do that. I always knew where things were, just because you had the sense of geography of a book. So I might not be able to tell you it was on page 67, but I could tell you it was on the left side of the book, towards the front, at the top of the book. And so you got this placement in your head. So no matter what book I went in, whatever edition it was, they're all approximately the same size if it's a physical device. But now on my, as I flick through, I have no idea. Even though it tells me at the bottom I'm 2 hours out or 20 pages in, I don't have this physical sense of where I'm living in that book. I could be anywhere. I'm lost geographically.
Yeah, you use the word geography a lot, which is interesting. People don't talk about geography with the book. But I'm going to push back on you with a little bit with that, because I think, you've referenced in previous podcasts, and anyone who knows you knows that your mind is a little bit different than most people's. And so the way that you have a retention for these things that a lot of people don't have. Leigh, I can sit and I can read a book and I can say, yeah, that was great, and these were some good thoughts. But if I go back and I try to find it, then I'm flipping through to where I had highlighted it, or I'm looking for the chapter cues. I'm looking for those types of things which geographically will remind me. But if I have, if it's digital, then I can just go to the search tab and type in a keyword of what I'm looking for, and within 3 or 4 clicks, I've got it.
Yes and no. So if I remember an exact word, you can do that. But if it's an idea, and it isn't quite the word I remembered, but I attached it to a word because the whole phrase connected, can't find it if I don't know the exact word I'm looking for.
Well, I agree with that, but that's a difference in those two modes of finding things. That's not an argument that one mode is superior.
Okay, I'll agree with that. It's more practical for me.
Mm-hmm. I can see why. I happen to be good at remembering the exact wording, but I can see why the geography is an important marker. But I don't have a good argument for why it's a superior marker than the ones that are available in digital reading. Even though I feel like physical books are superior, I don't have good reasons for believing that.
I would say that mine's a flawed reasoning, because I've never had to practice memorizing the exact word to find out where I was going to research something again, because I did rely on the geography. Maybe if I was starting all over again as a 5-year-old, I would learn to know the exact words and the geography wouldn't matter.
Right.
And maybe there's nothing wrong with that at all. All I'm saying is then you would never know you could have used the geography, versus I know I could memorize the word.
So should we pursue modes of reading that have, or media of reading that have the most modes of navigation?
The more you do of anything in multiple ways of the same thing, I think is better for you. So I'm not opposed to any of these digital resources. I'm just making sure that we don't lose the value of the previous resources we had.
I'd say it sounds to me, you look through books probably very similarly to the way that I do. It's an exercise in memoria to actually read through a book, because I never used bookmarks growing up. It was only like more recently when I would pick up a book and not touch it again for a month that I started to actually use bookmarks. You just got busier. But I would remember what page I was on, or at the very least remember where on the page I was, what I was reading about, and it was always very quick to find it. And then when I went back to look for things later, they were easy to find again. I remembered where they were, just like you said. But now I do prefer digital, like Jeremiah mentioned, because a lot of times I'll remember thinking about something or referencing something, and I can remember at least one word out of the context that will help me, Control F and find it on the book.
Yeah, I will say this, I'm a keyboard shortcut guy, so Control F and things like that, I use all the time, and you don't realize how much it you try and incorporate that into your whole life instead of outside of just that digital world. I sat down at a restaurant the other day and I knew I wanted a specific type of burger, and the menu's in front of me, and my left hand, immediately my two fingers tapped on the menu, physical menu on the table, and I stared at my hand. And I realized I was hitting Command F, trying to navigate and wondering why it didn't work. Because I did it without thinking. My daughter, we have one of those trash cans at home that you wave your hand over it and it opens up, right? So this is the only trash can she's ever known. So I take it, she's 3 years old. I take her in the bathroom the other day and we wash her hands and everything. And then I look over and she's waving her hand over the trash can there. And it's one of those that you push down and it flips and it just slides, it's a flippy trash can. And she's waving one hand and she's waving both hands. And I watch her and she's waving both hands all over the top of this trash can, trying to figure out why it won't open up for her. Yeah. I'm like, this one doesn't work that way. Socrates used, and I don't know where I'm at with this, okay? Because I spend my whole life, I'm a project manager here, and I spend my whole life in front of a screen. I'm very digital. I'm staring in front of a computer, most of the day long. So when I come home, I like having tactile things. I enjoy cooking because it actually uses my hands, okay? I enjoy smelling it and things that you can't do if you're staring at a screen. So I get that there's a beauty. And I think the studies show that even people who are, would say, yes, I do enjoy technology. I think books is the one part of technology that they rebel on, and they actually like the paper book as opposed to, all the other benefits included. They'll when they have a choice and they can read it because of the large print or whatever, they'll still opt for the large or for the handheld tactile paper that they can see and they can smell and they can mark up. So I get that. But I think, Chris, you made an interesting point about memoria, because Socrates was the one who said that the books is not a tool for remembering, it's a tool for reminding. He said the written language doesn't help you remember things. It just reminds you.
I don't disagree.
Back to the conversation.
That's good. It's important to, I think that informs the way that we take notes. If you try and write a whole sentence down, I feel like that's an inferior note. I feel like the act of writing down an entire sentence is a distraction from whatever you were taking a note on, instead of writing a few words that will remind you. Because for one thing, I feel I'm wasting effort if I write an entire sentence, but also then that sentence, because it resembles the whole thought, replaces the whole thought and limits it.
Even though there are all those studies that say people learn in different ways, the whole pyramid of learning, and if you write, if you just listen to it, you remember a certain amount. If you write and listen to it, then you remember more. And then if you teach it, you remember more. So you're saying that you would say just listen.
No, listen, but write reminders.
Write reminders,
not full notes.
Huh.
Because you can't listen to the next sentence if you're writing the whole word out.
Yeah.
Right. Taking notes is an art that I don't know if it's lost or not. I just know most people I know aren't very good at it.
It's because people want to write down a soundbite that they heard from the thing, not a few words that remind you of the entire thing. That's what I was
That's a
getting
modern construction that you just said, because that's one thing I noticed about 4 years ago is that everyone in my family was always trying to be witty. I was like, where'd that come from? And then I realized all this internet short tweets made us all be sarcastic and witty instead of thoughtful. And
well, so the internet has kind of ruined our memory too, because I know that there are, what Socrates said is true. If it's a tool for reminding you, not for remembering. When it was oral and you had to listen, you had to remember, there was no plan B. So if you didn't remember it, you couldn't pass it down. So it was important that you remembered and you heard and you filed it away. I've seen a lot of studies too about how Google is ruining our memory, about how when you know that, or you expect that you're going to have access to future information, then you have a lower recall rate.
Right.
And I think there are a lot of studies that are showing that that's true as well. Maybe that's what Socrates was saying.
because everybody always memorize. You can't not. If you speak a language, you're constantly memorizing and accumulating words and visual memories and things like that. But I think the person who intentionally reads harder books is just going to do more. Their memory is going to be better built because of the effort that they took.
Because they're tending to it. Yeah.
Attention's important. Okay. So are your children going to listen to this and wonder why Dad's saying let's all have digital books?
No, I mean, because Dad's all over the place. We work really hard with our kids to foster learning. I actually took my oldest son, who's 12. He loves reading. And I took him to his first
Reading
big,
books. that he
reading
holds
books.
in
Yeah,
his hand.
books. Yeah, we don't have we don't use iPads or digital stuff at our house. We actually try to be very conscious about our use of technology at our house. I understand its benefit, but we also understand that there's a lot of dangers with it as well. And we understand that there's something beautiful about, just engaging with things. And it's, when you engage digitally, it's a very different environment. But so Isaiah loves to read, and we have a lot of books at our house. And I actually took him to his first used bookstore, because bookstores are disappearing. I think we've
Yes.
all seen that. Now, independent bookstores we've seen over the last few years, they've started to rise up again. And now, what is it? The Canadian bookstore, the like Barnes & Noble chain, Indigo, just opened its first U.S. store in Jersey, like last month. So we're seeing a kind of resurgence in bookstores. People are realizing maybe how much they miss the bookstore experience. I realized I had a lot of great experiences as a kid going to used bookstores. And the smell when you walk in, it was just thousands of musty old books on the shelves, and you had to sort through them to find, a treasure that you took home. I took him to a couple of used bookstores the other day, his first time, and he loved them. He thought, this is so cool. They had all the records, LPs on the wall. For those of you who are listening, those are like big CDs. They were all over the wall and used books everywhere. And we had a good time sorting through books. You can never, it's like Netflix, right? Is how I explained it to him. Okay. They may not have exactly what you want, exactly what you're looking for, but there's never going to be a shortage of things that you can get to entertain you.
Good.
Yeah.
The other thing is, and again, maybe it's my age showing, but as much as I research on this little thing that's in front of me right now, this phone, it's never the pleasure I receive when I go shopping at a bookstore and get to experience that. I mean, it's holistic. It's all around you. It's the smells and the
Incorporate all
sounds.
5 senses. Yeah.
Yeah, everything. And people and somebody chuckling in the corner, and you're wondering why they're chuckling, and you want to see what they're reading
Feel
and
the
things
binding
like that.
on the book and thumbing through the pages. Yeah, everything.
It's a sensory experience. And so that makes the word stick too because of that nature.
Yeah. Because you smell it, you remember it takes you back. Yeah. That's.
So I will say that, we've done an interesting thing as a society where we have managed to create a space on the internet where people are willing to engage with and form ideas. And I would say that the readership as a whole for the country, while it may have declined, conversely, I think we're seeing more and more and more people actually interested in bettering and inquiring and seeking out better information. I think that's why you see a resurgence in reading, is because people have been looking for answers to things and seeing, oh, there's a podcast on that. There's an audiobook that's easy to listen to. I can reclaim my hour commute every day and actually do something with it. I can learn something there. And when you read a book, at least for me, I don't see it as replacing the conversation, and I see it as aiding in the conversation with others. I'm internalizing all this information, I'm synthesizing it, and then I can go back to people and have a better conversation about it. Because it's almost as if I had a question, I was looking for an answer, and rather than go to somebody and tell them and expect them to give me all my solutions right then, I can look at this book, and I've received this letter from the author that they spent months pouring their heart and mind into to answer my question. So there is something to be said about the book. Like I said, it's like a painting. They've gone over it multiple times, multiple strokes. And so you see a depth in the image that you don't see in a snapshot.
That's something we've been wrestling with CCMM. I work for the Classical Conversations Multimedia, and we want to be keepers of the book, like Leigh, like you said there. We think it's important to have books holding in your hand. We do recognize that the world we live in is very digital, and there has to be a multimedia element to everything that we're learning these days, just because that's the way the culture we're in is. But that's one of the interesting things that you mentioned there, Chris, is something we wrestled with this last time we all got together as a team, was some of the differences. And one of the things you said there is absolutely true, that a lot more work and effort and accountability goes into printing a book than it does. I mean, anyone can create a website and throw a blog or an article up there in 20 minutes.
Anyone can spend an hour recording a podcast and then post it.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing, right?
What?
But writing a book on this would be
Writing
much
a
more
book,
difficult.
yeah, you have editors, you have people holding you accountable. There's more financially at stake. So, by the very nature of creating a book, that it's been more well researched, and you can have more trust, and it's that what it's presenting to you has been through the ringer a little bit more.
I don't know if that's its nature. I think that might be just a circumstance.
Explain.
Well, so books have undergone less and less rigor as it became easier and easier to print them. There was one of the arguments against the printing press in the first place, and I don't know if it was an argument when they were developing that glue that would allow them to make paperbacks. People have been trying to make a paperback book for a long time, and there was a certain glue that would still remain flexible after it dried that made paperbacks possible. Paperbacks allowed a lot of things to be published suddenly that wouldn't have cut the mustard before. So I'm not sure if that's. Yes, the books we encounter today, by their nature, have been through the ringer more than the internet articles we encounter today. But I'm not sure if that is and will always be the nature of the printed word.
We've all read a book where we went, this could have been summed up in a blog.
Yeah.
I could have read one article and you gave me a 200-page book.
I think
Do not waste my time.
I think we've all read a book where we've said this shouldn't have been allowed to go to print.
Yeah.
Probably once in our lives.
Well, and there's a big, absolutely. And I think we all completely agree that there are some things that are printed that should never have been printed. Mm-hmm. Magazines, whatever. There's a lot of things.
Some of the books I wrote.
Yeah. Let's not do, but yeah, I mean, you're right. It's much easier. I mean, heck, I wrote a kid's book for my kids, and had a friend illustrate it, and it took, it was super easy to do. And I did it because it was something that they can have and cherish. Now, it wasn't mass market. It was self-published. I mean, there's like 5 copies. But at the same time, you can do it. And I was not held to a high standard of accountability or quality control when I did it. Right. So I get that. But I do think, by and large, just the fact that you're putting your name on something that you can't go back and change. If you put something online, you can go in and ninja edit and do a swift, change and fix something that if you messed up or someone points out an error, I mean, you can fix that real fast. So there is more accountability to the printed word than there is to something digitized.
If you care.
If you care enough.
And
that's
so
true.
I appreciate what you said, Jeremiah, because the team you work with care very much and they want it to be top quality. So they put the extra effort in. But Tobin's right. Not everybody has to do that, and you still can have a book that's written.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. And there's the amount of work and effort that goes into creating any of the books that CCM produces, is outrageous. And there are still little things that slip through.
I know.
And they're so frustrating when it happens, because sometimes it's big deals, sometimes it's small deals. Usually it's just little things. But when you have, 10 different proofreaders go through it and you recognize the accountability that goes into something like that, and you still miss a comma here or a quotation there or just, whatever it would be, it can be frustrating, but it gives you a lot more. I think going through that process, what I'm trying to say, it gives you more trust in the research that's gone into a book over something that's been just sent up on the internet. But I will say we were talking about a book earlier today, Chris, that you mentioned this could have easily been just a blog article. Instead, they managed to wrangle 200 pages out of it. Have you guys seen the market for like summary books, like Cliff Notes versions of things where they'll take all the business books and they'll just grind it into like 20-page.
Like the Harvard Review kind of things.
Yeah, exactly. That stuff is so good.
Because they have people that like, usually they have experts calling it to the key points. And so they are narrowing it to what they think at least is most important. I mean, in some ways it's like an edited textbook. It would still be better to have a fuller knowledge, but if you can only get so much.
But I'm not sure. When I've read business books, I feel like there's a lot of chaff. I feel like it's a very inconcise writing style that I wish it was already 20 pages in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, was it you, Tobin, I was talking to about, like, that's the Pearl Jam method of making albums. You'll make an album like Vitality or 10, and you'll have 3 songs that are amazing, transcendental, best rock songs of all time, and like 7 songs of just absolute nonsense. And you say, this is rubbish. This doesn't deserve to be on here. This is
it makes the other sound so much better.
They obviously, that's why they do it. Set the bar low, because then when you do something good,
I like that. There's a value in having written and reiterated points over and over and over again. And so when you read one of those books, it may be that you need to hear that 4 or 5 or 20 times over the period of 2 chapters to really understand and synthesize your thoughts. It's like Leigh mentioned earlier when she used to read voraciously, how she actually could hold the ideas longer and mull them out more thoroughly and come to a deeper understanding of the consequence and root of the idea. Whereas now the idea is more fleeting. because you're not engaging with it for as long. So when you're reading one of those books, I think there is, again, a value to have it summarized, because sometimes you don't have 2 weeks to spend on an idea.
Yeah.
You've got to get something out of that idea quickly. And so you can have a summary and get something valuable there, but you aren't going to know it. You won't have a full knowledge of it. And sometimes if it's written well, the writer, the author has hopefully spent a good deal of time constructing, forming a way to tell it to you so that you're going to hit it over and over again.
That's why nonfiction's so good.
Nonfiction.
No, I mean fiction.
So there's one of my favorite fiction authors is Louis L'Amour. He's a Western author, and he wrote a lot of stories early in his career where he was paid by the word. And he said, nobody ever died with a single shot in a gunfight. It was always bang, 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 bang. And you would have things like that in there. And there was it's not it's you are, so there were all those types of things just to make more words and bigger page count so he would get more money. And I think that obviously happens in books now, because if you pick up a book and it's 200 pages on the latest business practice, you're going to say, oh yeah, obviously this is more important than that one that's done in 20 pages. When really, someone's run a synopsis of your book in 20 pages and it's just as good.
I'd say Dickens is an example of somebody that was paid kind of by the word, but did it very well, because he was, there were these short little tiny books that were released over and over again. And that's why he has so many good, cliffhangers and plot twists. And
Well, they were published by chapter rather than by the whole book,
and
some of
so,
them.
yeah, even his last book, we don't even know what he intended for the ending because he left no notes behind for it, because he was just kind of going out of his brain.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
And so we don't know, did the guy kill him? Did the other person kill him? Did he actually die?
Was Dostoevsky paid by the word? Because that stuff is massive.
So the Russian readership, I think, had is a very different people than the Western. Western novels are considered a very Western form of writing. The Russians, I think, and they wrote very differently. They had a very different mindset on what a book should be.
So would you rather, let's say time is not an issue, would you rather read the book or watch the movie?
Time is not an issue.
Time is not an issue. Because I know that's why people say, that's the argument. People say, well, look, I don't have time to sit down and read the book. So
if it's a Susan Collins book, I'd rather watch the movie because she wrote them to be movies.
We're assuming that books and movies adapted from books are equivalent. And I think there's really only a handful of movies adapted from books that are even good movies.
Yeah, but that's you, Tobin. The mass of people think they have a choice and that they got the same thing. I can remember.
Well, they don't, though. That's why I reject the question. They do think that, but they don't have the same thing.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
It sounds like we're on the same page.
Yeah. So I was just reminding, because I remember my mom, who I love to death, obviously, she saw the Narnia series Disney put out, or Walter Media put out, and then she saw Tolkien, and she's acted like she knew all about both the books. And I was just like, Mom, those are movies. That's not the book. So that was pretty typical of most people. They think they don't. So your question, I think, actually is valid, which is you're saying it's not valid if you really understand what the two things are, right?
Okay. But it's valid in that a lot of people ask it. Also, there are a lot of movies that are written as a book first now, so they can test the market. Because it costs a lot less money to distribute a book. And those are being written as movies, so they probably don't lose a lot in the translation.
Well, that's one of the things I can tell you about modern fiction compared to older fiction is when I read them, I feel like I'm reading a movie script. The person who wrote it is hoping that's what will happen. And so people will say a book's really well written, and I'm like, what are you talking about? It's a script. It's not a book. Because they can't even distinguish the difference because they've all been scripts for the last 10 years. And so that's just kind of disappointing.
I'm going to say something really contentious and say I'd rather watch the movie. And my reason, I will say, is because that's what the conversation I'm going to have with others will be about. And rather than stand above them and go, no, you didn't understand the source, I'd rather actually be able to have a conversation from their perspective.
If you could only pick one.
I want to stand above them. You actually think that to yourself?
I do actually think that.
You're so kind.
So now wait a minute.
But I'd rather grapple.
Not. You're what you're doing is you're saying I would rob myself. You've already said that the book has so much more fruit and is great.
I think it can.
You set up a situation where he has to choose, Jeremiah.
Yeah, and I'm saying if I have to choose, Jeremiah, I'm going to choose to watch the movie because I want to know what they were fed and be able to work through it with them and say this is what the movie communicates, rather than go, oh, but they missed Tom Bombadil.
There's the one.
That's the one. But they did miss Tom Bombadil. It's a problem.
You went there.
So this is where Tobin's right.
I've not had.
I don't think Chris's motives are completely altruistic. You know, I think you're saying you would sacrifice a greater knowledge for self education, which
You
comes
can
from the
always
book.
seek more knowledge, Jeremiah, and it
Oh
will
my
never give you
goodness.
happiness.
Oh my goodness!
Jeremiah,
Stop it!
Jeremiah. You can always learn more, and what will it give you but more questions?
Oh my goodness! Oh, okay.
I can sit here and be the most educated on a topic, and you could be the second most educated, and we will completely disagree on every point.
No, I mean that's true. I agree with you.
Well, then are you really educated if you disagree on every point of the same topic?
Theologians,
Somebody's wrong.
somebody's always wrong.
Oh, that's what you're trying to say.
That's what I'm saying. Someone will
Oh,
always be
okay,
wrong.
okay.
Knowledge will only it makes you dissatisfied. It doesn't fulfill you. So
Knowledge dissatisfies you, doesn't fulfill you.
I think it does.
Interesting. That's
knowledge
another
alone,
whole
yes.
podcast. Let's do that one.
It doesn't have to be innately dissatisfying, but you cannot find satisfaction in it.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
I think Proverbs deals with that pretty heavily. It talks about difference, knowledge, and wisdom. How wisdom is what fulfills, not just the information. So yeah, you're right on that. I'm just saying why. I keep going back to your point there because I don't know if that's right. I mean, to sacrifice your own knowledge which we get from actually reading the book, with the only benefit being so you can engage in better discourse with other people.
Well, that's because you're answering as an or. If it was an and, you would just do both.
Right.
Right. It's the way you phrase the question.
I got it. I would definitely do both. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. I could see that.
You just have to have time for both.
Yeah, and I'll watch the movie before I read the book. I still do that. If I know they're both, and I'm like, oh, maybe I'll read this book. I'm going to watch the movie first because I want to know what they saw rather than go, they got that wrong too.
Mm.
So now we'll read the book and go, oh, they got it wrong in the book because the
No.
movie's right.
No,
Why don't we do that?
because it's richer. So actually, this is funny. I remember this. I think I was probably 12, and the Christopher Paolini, The Inheritance Cycle,
Oh, yeah.
the first book, Aragon, the movie came out, and I went and saw the movie. And oh my gosh, dragons! It was so cool. It was just the coolest movie I'd ever seen. And I got back home.
How old were you? When?
12.
12.
Oh
It's
yeah.
12.
Okay.
I went, Mom,
Here we go.
I want the book. So I get the book, and I spend the next probably 2 weeks just devouring this book, and then remembering the movie very fondly throughout, but loving every bit of the book and not realizing how far off the book the movie actually was. And I think about a year later, I saw the movie again, and I just wanted to claw my eyes out. Everything was wrong. Every single point was completely wrong. I was so confused. Now, how did I remember this being good?
So which one of those brought you greater satisfaction? Reading the book?
The
or
book
watching-
did.
The book
The
did.
book did. But I think, it's interesting because I can still remember the joy that the movie brought me that first time and go, okay, so if you only saw the movie, you might actually remember it well, like I did as a 12-year-old. And we could have a conversation about that experience of the movie. And I know it's not all the way there now because I read the book but I didn't think as I was reading the book, like, oh, they got that wrong. Oh, the description of this character is wrong. She has black hair. She had blonde hair in the movie. I didn't think that. I just enjoyed the book for what it was because the movie is over in a couple of hours and you don't remember all of it. But the book you sat with for a long time and you form thoughts and you imagine and you build
Your
that
imagination.
universe.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Your imagination. You're right. You're building all the details yourself. And the movie, you don't have to create those things. It feeds it to you.
So people will argue you can, and that movies can be helpful in that way. But the reality is, very few of us do because after 2 hours, you're gone, and it's not enough of a struggle to sit in your brain. You learn through wrestling.
I'm not sure if I feel like that's true of a lot of books that are published these days too. That they're not written to be challenging or stimulating, just to be placating for a while.
Well, I guess if you read bad books, that's true.
Well, sure.
And
But
disclaimer.
there are a lot of bad books printed
Full disclaimer.
because it's cheap to do so.
If you go read
Chris.
Aragon right now, you're going to go, wow, this was written by a 16-year-old and it shows.
Right.
I'm glad you threw that out there to kind of cover yourself.
Yeah.
It's amazing that 16-year-old got major motion picture,
It's
right?
true.
And a
Hey.
big book deal.
Good for him,
Yeah.
you know?
Excellent.
It's a great world. Piggybacking off of Tolkien, who, stole everything from Norse mythology. So
There's no new stories, are
Yeah,
there?
there are no new stories.
Which goes back to our opening. It makes me think, about stories resonating. Is there is only the great story of Jesus being our Savior, and so if you're on a hero's journey, that's what you're looking for. We're all looking for something that's more than ourselves, and those are the stories I think that resonate with us. We only have a few minutes left, and I would like to actually give our listening audience a few recommendations of books to read. Did you guys get to think about favorite books or ones you want to recommend, or what's on your bedside table now?
Hero's Journey. It's like an academic book for regular people. It has so many passages in it that are so beautiful about what dreams mean and how thoughts work and why we like stories. It is
Who's
a
it
book,
by?
Joseph Campbell.
Oh, you told me that.
And it has many. You wouldn't expect from a nonfiction thesis to stop halfway down the page and just absorb the beauty of an observation that he's made. So that would be my first favorite thing that I'm reading now. Other favorite, of course, is Lord of the Flies. Probably the most significant novel of the 20th century. I don't think it gets enough credit. And
why? Tell us why you like that and why you think it's significant.
Well, it's a portrait of the 20th century, and I don't understand how someone could have summed up everything that happened in the 20th century in as few words as that. It is a picture of. I don't. It's hard to explain.
It's a brutal book.
It's a brutal book. It's a picture of where evil comes from and how it lurks in our hearts, and it doesn't answer. It asks more questions than it answers. I think that's nice. I like how the characters represent different segments of society, showing that the same realities occur no matter how small the society is, and who the Lord of the Flies is. And of course, I believe in a literal Satan, but there is also the Lord of the Flies is more than the literal Satan. It is also a spirit of violence that lives inside our psychology. And I don't think I've ever seen that talked about in fiction as baldly as in that book. When Simon looks at that pig's head and it talks to him.
Yeah. That's quite the book. I've read it a number of times. So happy
I've never
thoughts.
actually read that. I've never read Lord of the Flies.
It's the Lord of the Flies is a direct translation of Beelzebub, by the way.
I mean, I'm 37 years old. I've heard of that book my whole life, and I've never actually read it. So I'm gonna have to do that.
It's
a
small.
good
You
read.
can read it really probably an hour.
Yeah.
So it's
I'll have
good.
to do it.
And it's a page turner.
Yeah, that's good.
So-
Thanks.
hmm How about you, Jeremiah?
Okay, so I go fiction and nonfiction, right? Some of the nonfiction ones that I'm working through for the second time right now is Crucial Conversations. It's a business book. Several people in our company have read it. By the way, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but CC, we reading books is really important to us as a culture here, and that's something that's been instituted. There are a lot of book clubs that are going on. So there are a lot of business books that I've read with different people within the organization. Actually, I think there's someone who works for the organization who, when they built an addition onto their house, they actually built books inside the walls because they feel like books are going to cease to exist at some point. And so it's going to be, it's an interesting side note there. Yeah, so keeping books is pretty important. But I'm working through Crucial Conversations in a book club right now with several other people at work, which is by Carrie Patterson. I'm reading A Fighter's Heart, which is by a guy named Sam Sheridan who traveled around the world to study MMA. I'm a big MMA fan, and he learned kickboxing and went to Thailand and all that stuff. Win Friends and Influence People, I recommend to everybody. Outside the Bible, that's the most influential book I think I've ever read by Carnegie. Of course, we can all say the Bible because that's the only book I've ever read that explains me to me, and says this is why I feel the way I am. This is why I have the struggles that I do. This is, why I have this longing for eternity. But, I still see the problems around me right now. So that's. But I would also say, growing up and even now, I would recommend Louis L'Amour, Ray Bradbury, and Bill Watterson. Louis L'Amour wrote Western books, and he showed me that there's great beauty just in his phrasings. There's great beauty in the world that's around me, Ray Bradbury showed me that there's a world beyond, like in the stars. He's a science fiction writer. He says that aside from the world right around you, if you look beyond that, there's another world that you can't see, but it's very real. And then Bill Watterson, author of Calvin and Hobbes, he taught me that when the world around me and the world that I know is out there gets to be a little too much, I can still close my eyes and I can imagine a whole different world. And maybe it's a little bit more enjoyable than the stress and the troubles that you go through every day.
He's a great mind.
Watterson's, absolutely incredible.
Christopher?
I've been debating for a while if I was going to be speaking on any nonfiction books, because that's almost exclusively what I read, even though I will decry them at every turn. I want to love
Doesn't
fiction.
Paul speak to that?
I want to love fiction books, and I keep trying to read them, and I'm currently working through War and Peace.
How
That's a
long
good way to
have you been working through
Can
War
you
and
try a
Peace?
different one first?
I'm going to have to. I've been about 2 months into to not getting anywhere in that book.
So we're halfway through the first chapter now.
I want to love fiction because I do know that fiction tells and speaks to the nature of the human condition in a way that I don't think just reading nonfiction does. That said, I do read quite a bit of nonfiction. How to Win Friends and Influence People, fantastic book. I think every person that's ever recommended a business book ought to recommend that one first.
Yeah.
So I wanted to drop one more idea.
Okay.
Put it in front of you, Tobin.
In case you want to say
I'm not
something.
going to say anything to your idea. No, go ahead.
Okay, so one thing I'd like to recommend, and anyone can do this, open your Bible and flip to that nice glossary in the front, and just put your finger on the page and like scroll down, and just don't scroll because it's not obviously. I mean, maybe you're doing it on a phone. I don't know. But just look for a book like Obadiah or Amos that you've probably not read ever, or at least in a very long time, and go read those again. You probably have no idea what's in that book.
That's a really good suggestion. You know, the canon's being reduced by even those people who believe in the canon, because with pastors moving around like they do so much, and they go to a new church and they preach Genesis and they preach John and they might get Romans and a
First
couple other, and then they're
Corinthians and
gone again. And
Ephesians.
the new guy does the
Yeah.
same thing. And so the canon's being reduced to 6 or 8 books rather than all of them.
Yeah. In terms of fictional books that I will recommend, Carry On, Mr. Bowditch was a book that I read in Challenge. I read it a couple of times and enjoyed it even more each time. So I'll give you that one. And then The Aeneid. If you ever feel like trudging through that gory, war story, and if not, then read the Odyssey, because that's a fun journey about returning home, even though at the end of the book he isn't satisfied when he finally gets back. But
He leaves again.
yeah,
After
Yeah.
all that,
after all that struggle to get home,
we are never content, aren't we?
we never are.
Well, that's because we are made for somewhere else.
Leigh, what about you?
Okay, so right now I'm reading by Donald Devine a book called America's Way Back. The subtitle is Reclaiming Freedom, Tradition, and the Constitution. I would recommend it to anybody because he's very, very good at being hard on all perspectives and what they have both done to contribute to the success of our country as well as to the decline of our country. So I think it's a really even-handed book, which you don't find very often. And then I've also been pretending to read A Canticle for Leibowitz. It's an audio book, so I'm trying, since reading's so hard, to listen to books. But I tend to put them on when I go to bed, and I stick that little timer on for 30 minutes, so it'll turn off. And I can't get past the sentence that this guy Francis is in the desert. And I think I've heard that line like 20 times now. So I think it's a good book. But I'm not sure. And then I'm just looking at a lot of math problems right now, spending a lot of
Developing
time.
the math curriculum.
Right, writing
Yeah.
math curriculum. So anything else you got to end with? Should we read books?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to foster that love of reading with our kids.
And don't think you need to just plunge into War and Peace to be a good reader, because that's a silly thing to do. Start small. Pick something actually that you can ingest, and it doesn't have to even be written word, I would contend. sometimes fostering a love for reading can come about through listening to things when in your spare time, listening to podcasts, listening to audiobooks, participating in conversations, and wanting to know answers. So
Yeah, and that's vocabulary building too. That makes reading harder books easier too.
right.
Can I tell you
Yes.
something? When I was growing up, we had an old Ford E150 van that there were 7 of us. And what my dad did is he actually took molding and made bookshelves in the windows of each of the sections of the van. So the back, right, and left, and then the middle left all had bookshelves that we would read. And we went on a 3-month trip one time, and we would stop, every like 3 weeks. We would unload all of the books that we'd read, and we would put, new books. We just swap them out at used bookstores. So we were constantly rotating as we were driving. We would have all these books we were surrounded by, and when we traveled, that's what we did. But you made me think there was a copy of War and Peace that was there the whole time, because I never read it. Out of all the books, I read all the books, but I didn't even touch that one.
I think if you fell asleep while reading that book, you'd probably get a concussion.
Oh my goodness! I looked at him like that's staying in the window. Give me the other one. Give me the Calvin and Hobbes.
Can someone recommend a Russian book to start with? Might be better than War and Peace to try and get into Russian literature.
Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich.
Yeah, that's the one.
Day in the life of Ivan.
Denisovich.
Just a day in the life of Ivan is enough. You'll find the book. All right. Well, with that, it's over. Thanks, guys.